The generation that lived through what Stalin got up to is dying out. For the young who didn't, honest history matters. How much do they know about Stalin, the gravedigger of the revolution?
Do you think that the statue should be taken down?
No!
He is a part of history and he belongs to glory, so his statue should be there.
He was a great leader at that particular time.
This is Georgia, not Russia. But throughout the former Soviet Union, especially in the sticks away from the big cities, Stalin remains more popular than most mass murderers.
Well, 75 years after the end of Stalin's reign, there's talk there about a rehabilitation in the face of tough economic times and fading memories of his actual rule. Comparisons abound. Russia's authoritarian leader Putin is a new Stalin. Europe's financial austerity measures are Stalinist. I've heard it all. Stephen Cohen, professor of Russian Studies and History at New York University, knows what's Stalinist and what's not. He's recorded the stories of victims of the Gulag in a new book, which features friends he's made over decades of reporting. Why is this history critical now? We'll find out. Stephen, welcome back to Grit TV.
Thank you, Laura.
So is this overblown, these Stalin impersonators going to high schools and this discussion about reviving at least the image of Stalin?
No. There is a Stalinist renaissance, as it's called in Moscow, sweeping across Russia. Public opinion polls confirm that about half the nation, both members of the elite and rank-and-file members of society, think that Stalin was a great and wise leader, and about half think he was a genocidal murderer. The nation's deeply divided.
And has that changed a lot over the last 75 years?
Well, this is the third time that Russia's had this national discussion of Stalin. The first time under Khrushchev in the 50s and early 60s, then of course under Gorbachev when it became the driving force, Gorbachev's reforms, and now this. What's interesting though, because it's a little terrifying, this worship of a mass murderer, is that none of these people who have pro-Stalinist views actually want to live under a new Stalin. They don't. They don't want terror, and that's what Stalinism was about. They don't want a despotic leader, certainly he was that. What they want is what they call a strong state. And they want it for this reason. They feel, and it's easy to understand why, because some of my liberal friends in Russia feel this way too, that the post-Soviet state, after the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, deserted the people, abandoned the people to oligarchs, poverty, crime, corruption. So they want what they call a strong state that will restore order, and order means social justice. That's very important for Russians. It's a historical kind of belief system. But a strong state, when they think back, they can't think of any except in this kind of dim memory, the Stalinist state of World War II and collectivization. So that's what they're giving their positive reaction to. It's understandable, but it's also dangerous because Russia's democratization is kind of stalled midway, and these sentiments don't help at all.
Is that why you decided to go back and write up these stories, many of them of people you've known for a long time, but who went through the gulags themselves?
That's not the reason. I began this book more than 30 years ago, living in Moscow. And people say, well, why did it take you more than 30 years to write a 200-page book? And the reason is this. Almost accidentally, I began to live among survivors of Stalin's terror, people who had been in the gulags and in exile and in the prisons. Of the millions who died, millions survived, and millions were released under Khrushchev in the 50s and 60s. When I came upon them in the 70s and 80s, they were, for the most part, elderly people, though there were a lot of relatives, children, who were younger, closer to my age. And as things evolved, I began to think it's my duty, or maybe they said to me, Steve, it's your duty to write this story, never be told. And I had the commitment. But for the next 30 years, I did other things. I got married to Katrina Vanden Heuvel. We had a child. I went to work for CBS following current news. I wrote other books. But I think the real reason was I didn't think I had the voice to write this book. It was so personal. And finally, when I gave up the idea of writing a big, thick, scholarly book and just write what I knew and what the people had told me and what I remembered, I had notes, I did some research in addition, it came out as this small book. The New Yorker called it a memoir. I had never thought of it as a memoir, but certainly it's autobiographical in that the reader meets a lot of these people through me, and through my wife, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, who was along for the whole journey. So it's a personal book, and it's not for, you know, scholars or specialists. It's for, but here's the thing. We know very well, maybe not well enough, but we know the story of survivors of the Holocaust. There's a large literature, memoirs, and even scholarly studies. We don't know the story of the survivors of Stalin's terror, who tried to go home and had a very hard time of it.
You're not the only one looking into this history. Russia Today has been running a series too. They call it Red Butchers. Here's a clip, first clip from that series.
NKVD Troika, probably the most feared term in the Soviet Union. The Troika was a commission of 3 members of the secret police, hence the name, a body created 75 years ago by Josef Stalin to quickly sentence those accused of political crimes. Virtually every single family in Russia lost someone in the repression. Dmitry Kantaev is one of the very few lucky ones to have survived the labor camps.
They took my father away one night with no explanations. They wanted to take away the whole family, but legally they couldn't arrest a young mother until her child was 6 months old. So they waited until I was of that age and took us to prison. From there we were moved to a labor camp. I was taken away after a few years by my grandparents, but my mother stayed there for 8 years. My father was executed, and it took us years to find his remains.
You could say that Russian television telling those stories is trying to put that history behind Russia today, as people fear the rise of authoritarianism in the current age. But before I get your thoughts on that, tell us one of the stories in your book. There's a woman, Anna Livona, and her son Yuri, who are
Well, that's the overarching story, because in the early 70s I published a biography of Nikolai Bukharin, who was the preeminent victim of Stalin's terror. And later in the 70s, I learned that his wife, who was 25 years younger, and his young son had survived the terror. Bukharin was shot in 1938. Anna Lauren, Bukharin's widow, spent 20 years in the Gulag. Yuri grew up in an orphanage without his real name, not knowing who he was. They met for the first time, since they had been separated when he was less than a year old, in the early 1950s. This story was repeated hundreds of thousands, excuse me, if not millions of times across the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s. It forms an entire chapter of my book, families finding each other. A lot of people who came home looking for their children never found them. Where were they? Well, if they had grown up in orphanages not knowing who they were, and their names had been changed, when they came of age and went into the army or on into life, they virtually disappeared. But the NKVD, the Stalin secret police, the senior officers took some of the infants for themselves, childless families. I mean, even NKVD people want a family. Wife couldn't have a child, or they were too old. They took the children, changed their name. The records were destroyed. So it's a saga. There are people, there's actually a television show in Russia called, I think, Wait for Me, about people still looking for their relatives.
It parallels the Argentinian story in many ways. We've only got about a minute left, Stephen, but why are these stories so important? I mean, what happens to a society, in this case Russia or Argentina or even the United States, that doesn't grapple with its own history?
Well, there's different views of that. The liberal democratic movement in Russia, if that's the right name for it, takes the position, and this was Gorbachev's position, that until there's a full recognition of what happened, that Russia can't go ahead with its democratization, that it'll lapse or relapse into authoritarian measures. And I suppose that's true in some ways, but the story was told, certainly under Gorbachev. No one in Russia today, if they can read, can say, I didn't know. Yeah. If they want to know, it's all available. There's no censorship of this subject. And the big struggle now, to conclude, is to build a national memorial to the victims of Stalin in Moscow. It's a struggle led by Gorbachev. The president of Russia, Medvedev, has endorsed it. It was first proposed by Khrushchev in 1962. All these years, no national memorial. So this struggle is unfolding in Russia as we talk, and it'll tell us something about whether they can move forward or not.
All right, Stephen Cohen's new book is The Victims Return, Survivors of the Gulag After Stalin. There's a link at our website. Let's go out with one more clip from Russia Today. Thanks, Stephen.
Preserving the memory of those who perished in the Stalinist repressions has led to some Muscovites literally wearing their hearts on their sleeves. Tags with names of people killed in the Great Purge are available for sale. It's a throwback to the days of the repressions when tags similar to these would be sewn onto a prisoner's clothes. Those behind the tribute hope the tags will remind people they should not become prisoners of a falsified image and never forget the millions of those who perished for nothing.